To be able to hear the voice of all things, a mysterious power first mentioned by Wrigley in Sabaody when talking about Roger, implying it to be an ability that can be used to decipher the Poneglyphs. This later being confirmed by Big Mom, only for us to start to get a picture of what it really is, with Luffy being able to hear the voice of the Sea Kings in Fishman Island, and Roger being revealed to have had the same experience during his journey. As we progress through the New World, more of these weird occurrences present themselves, with also Momonosuke and Oden displaying the same ability, and all of these individuals with this power also being shown to be able to hear Zunisha's voice, other than just the Sea Kings. The way these events behave seems like some form of telepathy. When the voices are heard, there's no indication of any sound being made by the owner of the voice, like other characters hearing a sound that is unintelligible to them. It is heard independently of the medium the characters are in, like if it's underwater, the hearer behaves as if the sound is coming from no particular direction, as if it is a voice inside their own head, and the text of the voice appears in thought-like balloons that similarly convey this. The fact that observation haki is first explained as mantra in Skypiea as hearing people's voices could lead one to believe that this is just another form of observation. Yet, upon closer inspection, you'll see that observation could not possibly explain some of the events that have come associated with this ability. For one, why would they only hear the Sea Kings and Zunisha specifically? Because they don't seem able to use this telepathy to hear the thoughts of just anyone. Or more importantly, how was it that Luffy was able to have his voice heard by members of Law's crew inside the submarine underwater? Can they hear the voice of all things as well? How was it that Zunisha seemed to be sending specific information on purpose to Momo, like sharing his vision? How was it that Momo could hear Luffy's thoughts only specifically when Luffy wanted him to hear his thoughts, when he was deliberately communicating with him? What I'm getting at here is that in these instances of people hearing the voice of all things, we shouldn't just focus on the hearer, we should also focus on the speaker. Because while I am going to explain what it means to hear the voice of all things, what makes one able to hear the voice of all things, why is it that the Three-Eyed Tribe specifically is able to hear the voice of all things, and how this ability can be used to decipher the Poneglyphs, this ability to speak with this voice, well, really the larger power that this ability is a part of is what this video is really about. You see, it wasn't enough for me to theorize the existence of a fourth color of Haki. No, I'm theorizing the existence of a fifth as well. And the answer to such a mysterious and plot important power, a completely separate, secret color of Haki, will be found, of course, by looking to the most legendary of characters. I'm talking about the likes of Soul King Brook, Bobbing from the Big Mom Pirates, Miss Goldenweek from Baroque Works, 1-2 Jango from the Black Cat Pirates, and the true masters of telepathy. Yes, I mean them, the Den Den Muhsi. No, really, I'm serious, and I can't truly convey how much it warms my weirdo rat heart that the answers to such an important power are found in some of the quirkiest characters in the series, which is really saying something given this is One Piece we're talking about. Anyways, this here is the final video of the series on Haki, covering not only the voice of all things, but also all the other weird cases of telepathy and various bizarre abilities of hypnosis and illusions. Once again, it is recommended, if you haven't, to watch my theory video on the foundations of Haki before you watch this one. So in the Conqueror's Haki video, I mentioned how there are two separate aspects of the mind, opposite yet complementary, active and passive like Yang and Yin, that can be imbued into Haki, originating the color of the Supreme King and the color of emotion or voice. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the explanation, and we will do it by looking at these three shades of Haki that deal more strongly with the mind. Not only Conquerors and Emotion Haki, but also Observation. In the Observation Haki video, I explained how observation is heavily tied to the idea of Buddha nature from Zen and broader Mahayana Buddhism. The background, the canvas of all conscious experience, what remains when everything else is removed, the empty, undifferentiated, pure awareness. On this background is where conscious experience appears, be it sensory experience like sight, hearing, taste, but also more inner parts of conscious experience, so to say. Thoughts, emotions, imagination. This is the passive aspect I spoke of, conscious experience, and it is the basis for emotion or voice Haki. And then we have the active aspect, the will, impetus to act based on this experience, the individual's spirit, which is the basis for Supreme King Haki, the conscious experience of an individual. Their perception, thoughts and emotions at a given moment inform and affect their will to act. And their will to act, be it physical or purely mental action, like what they consciously decide to focus their mind on, through these actions change the individual's experience in a constant interplay, like the interplay of yin and yang. So the color of emotion is about imbuing Haki with conscious experience, so that this conscious experience can transfer to the mind of other individuals when they come in contact with that Haki. It's a Haki that allows one to share consciousness with others. So the type of ambition that would control this Haki is, of course, ambitions to communicate, connect, or even to become one with others. So notice that while Conqueror's Haki is about imposing your own individual spirit upon the world, thus having this competitive nature to it, this Haki is one that connects people together. I mean, theoretically, right? Have you ever actually seen this power being used? Of course we have. These instances of telepathy are precisely that. They are about deliberately sharing consciousness, in this case thoughts in the form of inner monologue, with others. Of course, though, it's not just inner monologue which can be shared, but any part of conscious experience, including sensory experience, which is why Zunisha could share his vision with Momo. Now again, I want you to take your focus away for a moment from the hearer and put it on the speaker, because this ability to hear the voice of all things ends up acting also as a distraction in the scenes from the speaker, probably on purpose actually, making it harder for the reader to figure out what's really going on. Take Luffy out of the equation for a moment, and you'll notice the Sea Kings were actually talking to each other via the same telepathy portrayed with thought bubbles. By the way, this means I'm saying Zunisha and the Sea Kings were using Haki, right? So let me bring back that table I used in the Haki Foundations video, where I explain why people have Haki but not animals in general. What makes people different is that we possess reasoning, which enables us to have higher aspirations instead of being moved by simple instinct. That is, we have dreams and ambition. Notice this applies also to all the other humanoid races and to any animal that has human-like intellect, like the Sea Kings and Zunisha. And actually, it can apply even to creatures that couldn't even be described as animals. For example, notice there were other moments of telepathy, of sharing thoughts, before any of this voice of all things stuff even came into play. I'm talking specifically about the Going Mary's Klabautermann. All the times the Mary communicated, it was through the same thought bubbles. Try to remember now that when Mary arrived to save the crew could hear Mary's voice, but others around them couldn't. Of course, Mary is a boat animated by some kind of spirit. Doesn't seem to me like Mary would have vocal cords. So how can the Mary communicate with them? Of course, telepathically, by directly sharing consciousness with them. Now, to share consciousness with another individual, you must be able to connect your mind to theirs in a way. You must attune this voice haki to them, to their mind. Of course, it helps if you already share a strong connection with them. And see, of course, only the Straw Hats would initially be able to hear Mary's voice, because they are the ones who had a deep connection with the Mary. Similarly, way before the Mary even arrived, we see that Usopp could already hear Mary's voice, because Usopp is the one who had the deepest connection with the Mary. During Mary's funeral, when Mary is thanking the Straw Hats and saying goodbye, it seems like Mary's voice becomes the loudest, so to say. Here, even the Galila carpenters on Iceberg's ship seem able to hear Mary's voice, though probably not make out the actual words. But of course, as carpenters of Galila working for Iceberg, they already have a strong connection with ships. So it's not clear to me if just anyone would be able to hear Mary's voice here. Iceberg, for example, was able to hear Mary's voice way back in Water 7. First, seemingly only when touching the ship, and then after having fixed it, probably due to having built a stronger connection with it, he could hear Mary's voice even at a distance. Wait, but how can a spirit of a boat use Haki? Well, Klabautermann will be explained in part 3 of G.U.S.T. For now, you just have to accept it, I guess. Now, we actually have a canonical case of telepathy in the One Piece world, and we see it all the time. It's Den Den Mushi. Den Den Mushi do, amongst themselves, pretty much all of the things that we have seen achieved with this power of voice. They can share voice, vision, and it seems maybe even emotions. This similarity between the Den Den Mushi and the telepathy of emotion haki is on purpose, and you will see why further on. But for now, notice how when Usopp hears Mary's voice in Enya's lobby, it is directly following this panel of a Den Den Mushi loudspeaker, deliberately confusing the reader if the voice Usopp was hearing was from something else or just from this Den Den Mushi. Now, the chapter when this ability to hear the voice of all things is mentioned for the very first time by Rayleigh is also the chapter named Kizaru Arrives. Kizaru is introduced with a gag of mistaking the wiretapping Den Den Mushi in his wrist for his regular Den Den Mushi and trying to speak to it. This wiretapping Den Den Mushi, called Kuro Black Den Den Mushi, is actually the very first special type of Den Den Mushi introduced in the story, way back in chapter 128, and it is described by Oda as a Den Den Mushi that likes to overhear the conversations of others. And this is kind of what hearing the voice of all things is really about. This is what is special about Luffy, Roger, and Oden when they heard the Sea King's voices. The Sea Kings were not talking to them, they were telepathically speaking with each other or to Shirahoshi. Luffy, Roger, and Oden basically unconsciously wiretapped into those conversations. So when the Straw Hats could all hear Mary's voice, or even the Galila people, or when Lost Crew could hear Luffy's voice in Wano, they didn't need to be able to hear the voice of all things. They just needed to be able to hear the voice of individuals who were actively trying to connect and communicate with them. So why would Luffy specifically talk to Momo via this power when apparently he could use it to communicate even with people who can't hear the voice of all things? Probably it's a matter of distance. Luffy could have his voice heard by Lost Crew who can't hear the voice of all things because they were nearby. To communicate all the way from the Wanosi to Onigashima way up in the sky, it probably helps that he doesn't need to tune his emotion haki specifically to Momo, as Momo would be able to hear it regardless. In this situation, it helps that Momo is a really good listener, so to speak. So, in the observation haki video, I talked a bit about how people can use imagination to perceive things that are not being picked up by the senses, while using the same mental tools as the senses, imagining objects by visualizing them in the mind, seeing their shape, color, and even smell, sense to the touch, etc. And how this ability to picture, imagine things almost as if they were real is commonly referred to as the mind's eye. Much like inner monologue, this also is a part of conscious experience, and thus one that could be shared with others using emotion haki. If someone with a powerful imagination, able to picture things with great detail, were to share such a powerful mental picture with someone else via emotion haki, the affected individual would see that same mental picture. Yet, without knowing it was a mere product of the imagination, how could they tell it apart from something real that they are truly perceiving with their senses? To share a powerful imagined sensory experience with someone would be to cast an illusion upon them. To share a powerful imagined emotion with someone would be to make them feel that emotion strongly, essentially hypnotizing them. And this, the power of imagination, is key for some of the most bizarre yet most powerful uses of this color of haki. Now, someone who has canonically used a certain spiritual power for hypnotism is our good old Brook. Brook is able to hypnotize and create illusions with the power of his yummy fruit. He says that this is because the nature of his devil fruit is that there is a certain energy given by his devil fruit power that keeps his soul bound to the living world even when it should have transitioned to the afterlife. Because of this, Brook is able to use this soul energy to touch the souls of others and, according to him, bring them into his own world, thus bewitching their senses and their emotions. Now, Brook has also used the power of his yummy fruit for something very similar to another form of haki that we just talked about. He can use the soul energy to overpower the lesser souls of Big Mom's homies in something that looks and is even described very similarly to Conqueror's haki. And it's because Brook is able to use this energy from his devil fruit much like a regular person would use their own ki or energy in haki, and thus use it for very haki-like abilities. To delve a little bit deeper into the explanation here, because Brook is a really interesting case, remember what haki is: vital ki or vital breath, controlled in unnatural ways via ambition. In Brook's case, he does not have stamina from a biological source like regular people and animals. Instead, as described by Brook himself, this soul energy he gets from his devil fruit powers is what keeps him alive, animates his body, keeps his soul tethered to his body instead of passing on. This soul energy is basically his equivalent to vital ki. So for Brook to use this energy in haki-like ways is basically Brook's equivalent to haki. Whether one of Brook's soul energy abilities should be classified as haki or not, I believe is down to whether Brook uses his ambition to manipulate this energy in ways that normally shouldn't be possible, not just by regular laws of nature this time, but also by the nature of the fruit's powers. So, for example, Brook's freezing abilities, I believe, are just part of his powers of the Yomi Yomi no Mi, according to him, tapping into the freezing aura of the underworld, and therefore are not haki. Yet given what the fruit's powers are about, I would say the illusions and hypnotism are not part of the Yomi Yomi no Mi's regular abilities. So I would personally say they are likely a form of emotion haki. That is, Brook manipulating his soul energy in unnatural ways via ambitions of connecting and communicating with people. Now, hypnotism has been a thing in One Piece since the very beginning because of Jango, but one particular case of it comes to mind, that is Miss Goldenweek from Baroque Works. Now, full disclosure, my attention was brought back to this character by this post on Reddit, and it mentioned very interesting and weird things about her. So there's this Baroque Works cover story in which Miss Goldenweek behaves weirdly like Luffy, like immediately going to break into a prison to rescue comrades, fetching a pterodactyl ride randomly and completely carefree, stopping for ice cream when she's supposed to be hiding from the Marines, and disguising herself with an afro. This cover story finishes with her using her powers to make others see their dreams in what I can only assume is another hypnotic illusion, because otherwise, what the hell? But there's more weird foreshadowing about this character. Her real name is Marianne, and her epithet is the Flag Bearer of Freedom. Now, that is a pretty heavy title for such a seemingly minor character, isn't it? So, Miss Goldenweek used this ability known as Color Trap, in which she used her paintings to cause targets to feel certain emotions. This is described as her being a realist painter, that she is able to put her emotions into her paintings. By the way, this line by Vivi here, talking about the color of emotions, sure sounds similar to me to how different natures of Haki are named as colors. The color of arms, the color of observation, etc. This is why I named this power Emotion Haki, or Color of Emotion, because this is the closest thing we have to a canon name for it. Now, we know that unlike with Jango, this can't be a visual effect, because her powers would work even if the target never saw the painting. Rather, the conditions for it to work are that the target is touching the painting and that the symbol remains intact. Despite how bizarre, unlike anything else we have seen, and seemingly impossible this power is, it is confirmed not to be a devil fruit power. So what the hell is it? It's like this emotion or voice haki I have been speaking of was imbued in the paint. So why are the different colors of paint tied to different emotions? And why is the symbol for color trap itself important? So remember I said in the first Haki video that imbuement is about attuning Haki to a certain object or substance, to its breath, to cause the Haki to be attracted to it, bound to it, instead of dispersing. Because this color of Haki is about imbuing aspects of the mind into Haki, in this case emotions, Miss Goldenweek mentally associating certain colors to certain emotions helps with attuning and binding her Haki infused with these emotions to the paint. She can bind her emotions of melancholy to the blue paint, in part because she mentally associates those emotions with blue. She can bind humor, funniness to yellow because she associates it with yellow, etc. And because she associates the symbol for color trap itself to the technique, to imbuing her emotions in the paint, that too helps with keeping the Haki infused, the effect fading away as the symbol is erased. Likewise, by imbuing certain feelings into sound, like music, that you associate with these feelings, the sound can likely be used as a carrier for them, so that they act on the ones who hear it. But more than just giving us our clearest example of emotion or voice haki, Miss Goldenweek also holds many of the greatest hints of the connection of this power to voice, and also the key to know what it is that makes someone able to hear the voice of all things. So the first big hint here is in the very symbol for color trap that Miss Goldenweek used. Supposedly it's meant to be a C and a T for color trap, yet I think we can clearly see that this is a bullshit explanation. I mean, it's not that Oda didn't make the symbol in a specific way to be constructible from CT, yet it's clearly not what it's meant to depict. Would anyone seriously guess that this is supposed to be CT from looking at it? The T is deformed beyond recognition, looking more like a V if anything. The dot, which for some reason there's only one for the C and not one for the T, is moved to a completely different position after the T, leading to it looking completely out of place and random, and the C is closed and turned into a freaking circle, looking more like an O if anything. No, guys, look, this symbol is meant to be an eye. It's a sideways eye. The spiral kinda reminds me of the Eye of Ra or the Eye of Horus from ancient Egyptian myth, but that's not too important. The point is that people perceive the emotions that Miss Goldenweek is conveying through her painting, that is, they hear her voice, when they enter in contact with this extra eye, when they enter in contact with this third eye. Remember how the three-eye tribe are the ones with the innate ability to hear the voice of all things? Now, you might think this is a stretch, right? But see, this collar strap stuff takes place and is explained to us in chapter 124. This right here is the cover for that chapter. Now, I talked about this in a previous video, right? Sanji takes Express Tsuru with cranes, the bird that symbolizes immortality, and that in One Piece symbolizes Imu, a three-eyed woman. In Sanji's suitcase, we see The Secret, and the year 1830, the year of the French July Revolution. Remember the connections of Imu with France? So you all know this painting, right? The famous painting of the French July Revolution, having on its center a woman personifying liberty and being the flag bearer of revolution. This woman is generally seen as an artistic personification of France itself, and known by the name Marianne or Marianne, the flag bearer of freedom. And here is where we will find our answer to what it is to hear the voice of all things. See, just like Luffy can hear the voice of all things, Luffy is stated in this chapter to be particularly susceptible to Miss Goldenweek's hypnotism. Luffy's susceptibility to hypnotism has been a thing since Syrup Village. In fact, there is this very interesting moment where Luffy is seemingly so hypnotizable that he is hypnotized by accident. Jango is hypnotizing his crew members to make them more aggressive, and Luffy, from just being nearby, ends up catching this hypnotism and becoming hypnotized too. Even though the hypnotism was not meant for him, he ends up feeling it too. Much like Luffy can hear the voice of messages that were not meant for him. Now you might ask, what the hell does this hypnotizability thing possibly have to do with hearing the voice of all things? And the answer is everything. See, both times it is said that Luffy is highly hypnotizable because he is very simple-minded. But in fact, this is not what hypnotizability is about at all. See, hypnotizability or susceptibility to hypnotism is actually a surprisingly widely studied and empirically grounded subject in psychology.
Something that differentiates hypnosis from other mind-body techniques is that hypnotizability is a stable trait. Now, it changes in the lifespan, so most 8-year-olds are in trances most of the time, as you know, if you call your kids in for dinner and they're out playing and they don't hear you. But by the time we go through adolescence and start what are called formal operations mentally, we tend to settle into a very stable degree of hypnotic responsiveness. About a third of the adult population just isn't hypnotizable, the rest somewhat, about 10 to 15% very hypnotizable. And the test-retest correlation in a study done at Stanford some years ago was 0.7 over a 25-year interval, blindly retesting hypnotizability. Now, IQ isn't that stable.
What is it that makes a person highly susceptible to hypnotism? Remember who in One Piece is the one member of the three-eye tribe that have this ability to hear the voice of all things that we know closely? Pudding. The greatest predictor of hypnotizability is dissociative identity disorder, aka split personality disorder, marked by having at least 2 separate enduring personality states. Oh, and you know what is the greatest predictor of dissociative identity disorder? Well, 90% of people with it report suffering severe childhood abuse. But more broadly, since a study in 1981, the largest group of what are considered highly hypnotizable people are what have been known as fantasizers, or people with fantasy-prone personality. These are people who spend a lot of their time fantasizing, who are very prone to daydreaming, and who have very vivid imaginations. Fits Laffitte, doesn't it? Our starry-eyed protagonist filled with dreams, highly imaginative, always thinking of the craziest fighting styles, who has a devil fruit power that is described as being limited only by the user's imagination. Now, why is this the case? Of course, being hypnotized means to experience something that is suggested by others, something that is not actually being caught by your senses, a sensory experience or an emotion that is actually purely imagined. Much like a person with extremely vivid imagination can see, hear, or even touch or sense things that they imagine almost as if they were real. This ability to experience imaginary things, be it in seeing an imagined object in detail or even be able to hear, smell, taste or touch it almost as if it was real, is commonly referred to as the mind's eye, which of course is the basis for the spiritual concept of the third eye. Do you see it? Fantasizers are people who have a very active mind's eye, a very active third eye. Of course, the opening of the third eye is tied in many East and South Asian religions with spiritual awakening, which brings us back to that theme of the equivalency between dreams and spirituality. These individuals, because they can so easily experience emotions, mental states which are suggested to them, can experience the voice imbued in Haki even when it's not meant at all for them, even when it is not tuned for them. This is what it means to hear the voice of all things. And it makes sense when you think about it. Someone who's prone to fantasizing and who can get lost in their own imagination can more easily get caught in someone else's fantasy.
どこにあるんだ？それはね、すぎきの島で君たちの心の中さ。心。
But of course, you'll only be able to hear someone else's voice if you're listening to it in the first place. That is, if you're someone who cares about the thoughts and feelings of others. And so, other than being a dreamer, a fantasizer, it's also important to be high in empathy, which I had also described in Observation Haki video as being one of Luffy's traits. Now, though hearing the voice of all things isn't even necessarily Haki in itself, but a characteristic of certain characters that changes how they interact with emotion or voice Haki, if it were to be classified as a form of Haki, it would rather be observation, actually, and not this emotion Haki. I did talk about both of these traits that make one able to hear the voice of all things, namely imagination and empathy, in the Observation Haki video, and about their importance to observation. So the same traits that make someone able to hear the voice of all things also make someone have a disposition towards observation, specifically the form of observation of sensing the emotions and intentions of others. So it's probably no coincidence that Momo, who can hear the voice of all things, was also shown to be able to use some level of observation in Onigashima, sensing Luffy's and Kaido's presence by sensing their voices, much like Aisa way back in Skypiea and Otohime in Fishman Island, and specifically being able to sense Luffy's emotions, that he was in high spirits on the rooftop. Now notice this, being a dreamer, a fantasizer, someone with powerful imagination would be necessary to create powerful imagined feelings and sensations that can be imbued into Haki for hypnotic effects or illusions, right? And also being able to empathize, to connect easily with the feelings and thoughts of others is necessary to attune your voice to that of your target, to make your Haki and the feelings and sensations imbued in it connect with your target's mind. So the traits that make someone able to hear the voice of all things are also the ones that would make someone talented at using the color of emotion for illusions and hypnotism, which is probably why Miss Goldenweek is shown to behave so similarly to Luffy. But going back to the connection with real-life hypnotism, this would mean that the people who are more talented in hypnotism are also the most hypnotizable, which we also see way back with Jango in his very introduction and beyond, with his constant gag of falling for his own hypnosis. On the topic of Jango, in an SPS, Oda explained how he gained his hypnotic powers. He was a wandering dancer, but business wasn't good, so he just slept a lot, without even taking a bath. Eventually, a stripped mushroom grew from his chin. Because he was so hungry, he ate the cap of the mushroom, the stalk remaining as his fake beard, and somehow became able to hypnotize people. So, ignoring how disgusting this is for a moment, there are no swirls on the mushroom, so it really doesn't seem like a devil fruit. Given the talent for emotion haki comes from powerful imagination and empathy, and that experiences with psychedelic mushrooms are actually known to increase both of these traits in people, Jango awakening some form of emotion haki after a really crazy mushroom trip is shockingly a plausible explanation. Not that something like this would ever be confirmed by Oda, but you know, maybe can serve as fun headcanon. Now finally, we can address the Poneglyphs. If I say that voice in One Piece means mind or soul, sentience, and that thus only sentient beings have it, how come the Poneglyphs have a voice that Roger could hear, and actually from these voices decipher the meaning of these poneglyphs? If you watched part 1 of G.U.S.T, and if you still haven't, you really should, you know I say that the poneglyphs were made of kitetsu by the Kozuki and then permanently infused with Haki to harden them, making them indestructible. So if the poneglyphs contain voices, it's because voice or emotion haki was also infused in them. But what for? I believe that it's so even if the knowledge to decipher its writings were lost, the message in them would still be present in this telepathic form. The voice or emotion haki in them is tuned to no particular individual, and thus normally cannot be heard, except by people who can hear the voice of all things. Notice that the individuals with this power also happen to be the ones who are big dreamers and are high in empathy. Probably the exact type of people the ones who left the poneglyphs would want to hear their message. Essentially, the nature of this power ends up selecting the very individuals who these messages probably were made for. Some particular foreshadowings to these connections happen in the chapter named A Voice from the New World. The voice in question is Big Mom's voice that reaches Luffy via Den Den Muhsi. This chapter is the first time we see Pudding, the first time ever we see a member of the Three-Eyed Tribe, and immediately after seeing Pudding, we're introduced to Bobbin, the hypnotist from the Big Mom Pirates. Bobbin is also known for his questionable fashion sense, wearing a piece of paper in front of his face. This is a trait he shares with one other character, or I should say group of characters, Bao Huang and the Marys. Mary? Whatever. Bao Huang, by the way, is a Chinese card game meaning protect the emperor. These characters could share sound, vision, and voice, like literal voice, with each other. While this seems implied to be just some sort of technology, it's also blatantly used as an allegory to the power to hear the voice of all things, that is represented at times as Bao Huang almost looking through this mystical eye drawn on the paper. In fact, this makes me question if the hole on the paper on Bobbin's face was supposed to look like an eye somehow. But what is the symbolism here with the eye and the paper? Well, you see, paper in Japanese is kami, which can also mean God. Therefore, an eye of paper, kami no me, is a pun on eye of God. the all-seeing eye of providence. Now, I think I could show to you that there are deliberate connections made in One Piece between telepathy, hypnotism, imagination, and the Den Den Muhsi. But how would Oda come up with these connections in the first place? Between imagination, hypnotism, telepathy, and freaking telephone snails. And now we're about to get into one of my favorite parts of this theory. Is it one of the most impressive or clever ones? Not necessarily, but I do think it's one of the most entertaining. And it's convenient that Miss Goldenweek had all those references to France, because this story is about to take us to Paris right before the French Revolution. Europe, second half of the 18th century. It's the age of enlightenment, and scientists have been making strides in many areas. Particularly of interest are electricity and magnetism. People have made generators of static electricity, experiments with long-range transmission of electricity, someone catching lightning with a freaking kite. Things are going well, but electromagnetism would only become a thing in the 19th century, and it was not until the 1980s that Coulomb devised the inverse square relationship of the force between two magnets. So for the most part, people are like,
fucking magnets, how do they work?
Because understanding of magnetism is so poor or near non-existent, all kinds of bizarre myths about magnets exist, like being able to create sympathetic links between two compass needles upon entering contact with a special magnet, making the two always point in the same direction. Weird occultists believing that they could communicate long range with each other by trading flesh from their arms and then touching tattooed letters in the transplanted flesh with a magnetic needle, believing that the original owner of the flesh would feel it. And of course, all the weird beliefs about the healing properties of magnets, going back at least to the ancient Greek Hippocrates. One man in particular who became interested in magnetic healing was German physician Franz Anton Mesmer. Mesmer seemed particularly interested at how invisible forces that act at a distance could affect the human body. His doctoral dissertation used Newton's theory of gravitation, specifically concerning tides, to propose the possible influence that the moon and the planets could have on the human body, especially as causers of disease. So in 1774, in Vienna, Austria, Mesmer had a patient suffering from hysteria swallow a preparation containing iron and then use magnets in an attempt to move the fluid through her body. The patient reported feeling a strange fluid flowing through her body and was relieved of her symptoms for several hours. Mesmer believed that he had treated her by producing an artificial tide inside of her, but it doesn't take long before Mesmer does away with the use of magnets altogether. Mesmer theorized the existence of an unknown force, a sort of fluid that existed in every living thing and flowed through the environment, acting as a vital force. He called it animal magnetism, despite it being completely separate from actual magnetism, and thus that health was dependent on the adequate flow of this magnetic fluid, that disease could be caused by blockage of this fluid and healed by a practitioner of animal magnetism called a magnetizer, who had learned the power to manipulate this magnetic fluid and would thus use it to unblock the obstructed flow in the patient's body. So yeah, this thing sure as hell sounds a lot like medicinal qigong, doesn't it? Had Mesmer been reading some Chinese texts? It's possible, but I personally know of no evidence of it. But the fact is, you can see how easy it would be to integrate Mesmer's ideas into a power system based on qigong, right? Mesmer's standard procedure was sitting face to face very close to the patient, knees touching, stare them deeply into the eyes through the whole session, and make various passes of the hand, sometimes pressing his fingers at specific points in the patient's body, like the hypochondrium, but most often without even touching the patient. Now, with current scientific knowledge, you'd probably think that this is a bunch of bullshit, right? And there's no way that this is gonna work. Except it does, kinda. I mean, it was certainly doing something. Now, an important detail on Mesmer's theory was the belief that the undoing of these blockages caused crisis before restoring the person's health. And Mesmer was able to very reliably bring this crisis about. There are many written accounts of the effects that these techniques had on the patients, and they are wild. from as simple as coughing or having hiccups, to vomiting, having fits of madness, biting their own hand, crying, laughing, shouting uncontrollably, and violent convulsions. And just as easily as Mesmer caused these effects on the patients, he would take it away with a simple wave of his hand. Eventually, Mesmer began treating a prodigal pianist who had lost her eyesight as a young child. Mesmer was actually partially successful, yet this resulted in an enormous scandal. Her parents worried that the restoration of her eyesight could make her lose her appeal with the public and her disability pension, and physicians started ganging up on him to call him a charlatan. Mesmer then left Vienna and in 1778 moved to Paris. Mesmer's theories did not receive a warm welcome from either the Royal Academy of Science or the Royal Society of Medicine. This was not the case for the Parisian public at large. He became extremely popular, especially amongst the wealthy and the nobility. Even the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, became a patient of his. It got to the point where he had way more patients than what he could treat individually. So he started taking in disciples and doing collective healing sessions known as baquet, where up to 20 people would sit around a large vessel of water that had been magnetized by Mesmer, that had many holes through its lid, with iron rods with one end dipped into the water and the other at different heights or bent at different angles, so that the patient would touch it to the afflicted part of their body. See, Mesmer also believed that he could infuse objects or substances with this magnetic fluid, so that a person could get the fluid transferred to them and thus get the same effects by touching said object or substance. You know, kind of like Haki infusion, or how Miss Goldenweek would infuse emotions into her paintings. All this might sound really weird, but to be honest, when the other options offered by medicine at the time were leeches or surgery without anesthesia, you might as well go for the group sessions with the guy with the magic powers that's gonna put you in a trance state while some other guy plays the glass harmonica in the background. Parisian society became increasingly divided between those who swore by Mesmer's methods and those who saw him as a charlatan. It was a major topic of public discussion. Added to that, Mesmer got involved in controversies with the crown, like rejecting an offer made by a representative of the king that he had previously agreed to, and then publishing a public letter berating the queen, and the result is King Louis XVI seeing the need to officially settle this matter, and so he orders the appointment of royal commissions to investigate the validity of Mesmer's theories. 2 commissions are appointed, constituted by prominent physicians and members of the Royal Academy of Sciences. The first one being the most well-known and really most important. It is commonly known as the Franklin Commission. That's because it was headed by Benjamin Franklin. You know, Kite Guy. By this time, Franklin was already a celebrity scientist for his discoveries on electricity and was in France acting as ambassador for the newly formed United States. It also included as members guys like Jean-Sylvain Bailly, a famed astronomer and mathematician who would later become the first mayor of revolutionary Paris and then gets guillotined during the Reign of Terror. Chemist and biologist Antoine Lavoisier, one of the central figures during the Chemical Revolution, basically responsible from changing chemistry from a qualitative into a quantitative science, and then also gets guillotined during the Reign of Terror. And famed physician Joseph Ignace Guillotin, most known for his proposal of a device to carry out executions in what he considered to be a more humane method. Eat your heart out, Oda, this is what we call foreshadowing. But yeah, they assembled the rock stars for this shit. Mesmer mysteriously refused to cooperate with the commission, but his most prominent disciple accepted, and so they conducted what is largely considered to be the first prominent placebo-controlled study in history. Basically, they would do stuff like having a subject drink some water that she had been told was magnetized. She then proceeded to collapse in a full crisis, convulsing, basically dying, except they lied and the water wasn't magnetized at all. And then they would offer her some regular water to recover, and she'd be like, "Ah, thank you, kind sir, that's just what I needed." Except that water was magnetized and absolutely nothing happened. Basically, in every experiment they conducted, the determining factor for the person experiencing the mesmerizing effects was whether they believed that they had been magnetized or not, and not whether the magnetizing procedure had actually taken place. And so the commission concludes that Mesmer's theory on animal magnetism was incorrect. Note here that what the commission discredited was not the intense effects that mesmerism had on the patients. What they discredited was Mesmer's explanation of the effects with his theory of animal magnetism. This idea that it was this invisible fluid, this invisible force that the magnetizers could manipulate, which was generating these effects on the patients. They conclude instead that these effects, powerful as they were ultimately caused by the patient's imagination. Delon, Mesmer's disciple who collaborated with the commission, who agreed with the commission's conclusions, notes that Mesmer's practice in itself had not been completely discredited, but rather understanding that Mesmer's practice was ultimately successful due to its power to captivate the imagination. They had uncovered that control over the imagination would be extremely valuable in medicine. The commission's report destroyed Mesmer's credibility, turned him into a target of public ridicule. He once again was driven into exile, now from Paris. And it certainly must not have helped with his feelings towards the city when only 5 years later the French Revolution broke out and revolutionaries took all the money he accumulated in France. Yet this was not the end for Mesmerism. Despite the Commission's report and other similar reports that would be made in the following decades, animal magnetism continued to be a popular practice and influential in medicine for around a century more. Mesmer himself kept a low profile but continued his practice until his death in 1815. But the damning scientific reports, like the Commission's and others with similar conclusions that would follow, meant that Mesmerism would evolve in roughly two different paths. One sought to explain and replicate its effects, while doing away with the magnetic fluid theory and seeking to understand them via psychology. This was the path of James Braid and others. Braid, a Scottish surgeon and independent scientist, who was already convinced, based on one of such reports, that animal magnetism was unworthy of further investigation, decided to perform his own research on it upon seeing demonstrations by French magnetizer Charles Lafontaine and being convinced of the reality of the effects, while also remaining convinced that no magnetic fluid was involved. He performs his own experiments and develops his own theory and practice, borrowing and building upon what had been discovered by Mesmerism, yet fully based on the workings of the human mind alone, rather than some invisible fluid. He names it Hypnotism, after the Greek god of sleep, Hypnos, comparing the hypnotic state to a nervous sleep. The old technique of hypnotists of focusing the subject's eyes on an object near their face, like the classic swinging pocket watch or Jango's chakram, come from Braid's own upwards and inwards squint induction method. The second path that Mesmerism would evolve in was through those who stuck by the notion of an animal magnetic fluid. Yet the fact that very conclusive scientific evidence existed against animal magnetism meant that the idea would disproportionately attract the less scientific-minded individuals and get increasingly associated with spiritual, occult, and just downright wacky stuff. How wacky? Well, around 1850, French occultist Jacques Toussaint Benoit, who was a believer in animal magnetism, claimed that when snails mate, they exchange a special kind of animal magnetic fluid that formed a permanent invisible connection, like an invisible wire that kept them in a sympathetic communication. Why snails? I don't know. Silly Benoit. It turns out the snails are just gender fluid, and so they exchange gender fluid, and by that I mean hormones, to decide who's gonna be the woman and have to carry the babies. Which is actually the truth, despite it sounding just about as weird to me. Anyways, he has a brilliant idea to revolutionize telecommunications. He's like, guys, hear me out. What if we get 24 pairs of snails, we assign each pair a letter, we get the snails to have sex. Wait, guys, let me cook! So after the snails banged, one of each pair was sent to one of the ends of the Telegraph. If you, at one end of the telegraph, touched a snail, the snail it shagged on the other end would respond in some way, and so from that, the person at that end would be able to tell what letter you were trying to communicate. Benoit somehow managed to convince Monsieur Trat, manager of a gymnasium in Paris, to not only let him cook, but to finance his cooking, giving him lodgings and an allowance. 1 year goes by though, and Trat is like, okay bro, like you have a prototype or something? So in the 2nd of October 1850, Benoit invites Trat and his journalist friend Jules Alix for a live demonstration. He would ask an assistant, first Trat and then Alix, to spell out a word in one of the ends that would then be read at the other end. The demonstration was filled with suspicious aspects. The snails were not totally Wi-Fi via animal magnetism like he originally claimed, but sat on zinc basins connected by scaffolding covered in a copper sulfate solution. More importantly, there were no walls separating one station from the other. Benoit continuously went back and forth from one station to the other, claiming it was necessary to ensure the assistants were touching the snails correctly, and still he was getting errors in the words he read, like gymnast instead of gymnase. Trat was not very impressed at what Benoit had cooked and demanded a second, stricter test. Benoit agreed and then vanished before the agreed upon time, only to be seen wandering the streets of Paris and dying less than 2 years after. Alix, though, had been very impressed by the demonstration. He wrote high praises of it in an article for La Presse, suggesting even that women might wear a device like that as waist chains. Bro predicted mobile instant text messaging, except it was a belt of telepathic sex-having snails. A socialist, Alix, 21 years after the demonstration, during the Paris Commune, would somehow convince the president of the Commune's Barricades Commission to give the Snail Telegraph a try for their means of sending and receiving messages. As you can guess, it didn't really work, and was not able to keep the communards from being massacred and exiled by the French army. Unfortunately, none of these failures were enough to keep the French from continuing to cook with snails. But my point is, you can see how this was the inspiration behind the Den Den Muhsi, right? And that Oda probably read about this as he was reading about the history of hypnotism and mesmerism, as he wanted to include some form of hypnotism in the power system. And so the snail telephone remains as a quirky hint to this power's connection to this bizarre history. But what about the telepathy stuff? Is it just about the snails? As bizarre as mesmerism may sound to our modern ears, it was created as a scientific and materialist theory, largely in the modes of the developments in physics that preceded it. It was yet another imponderable fluid theory, that is, a theory that posited some invisible and weightless fluid. Heat and temperature at the time were largely understood through the caloric theory, created by Lavoisier, that thought of heat as a fluid, the caloric, that flowed from hot to cold bodies. Electricity was understood in a similar way. Franklin himself was creator and proponent of a one-fluid theory of electricity. In fact, mesmerism was arguably more along the lines of the standard scientific thought at the time, by positing the existence of some actual, discernible, concrete physical agent, in contrast with abstract concepts like imagination as used to explain its effects by the Commission's report. And so, even though it was conclusively disproven, animal magnetism offered a science-y way to describe invisible forces from an invisible, all-permeating substance having powerful effects on the human mind. And this was of great use to spiritualists and occultists. Suddenly, ideas of mind-to-mind communication and suggestion could be explained by thoughts being sent via this magnetic fluid from one mind to the other. Communicating with spirits of the dead? Well, maybe an imprint of someone's mind can stay in the magnetic fluid and act through it to speak to us in some way, or possess the minds of the living. Even back in Mesmer's time, there were magnetizers who claimed to be able to perform direct mind-to-mind suggestion, and even put people in states of clairvoyance. This is especially as the popularity of seances, that is, those attempts to communicate with spirits, was at its all-time high in the second half of the 19th century. One particular group of British men who were interested in mesmerism, as well as communicating with spirits and various other paranormal phenomena, founded the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, with the stated purpose of researching said psychic and paranormal phenomena, dissociation, thought transference, mediumship, poltergeist, Reichenbach phenomena, apparitions, haunted houses, spiritual events in seances, and, of course, hypnotism. One of its founders, for example, Sir William Fletcher Barrett, became interested in the paranormal after having a strong experience with mesmerism. He believed that he had been direct witness to thought transference. And arguably, thought transference was the holy grail the SPR sought after. Co-founder of the SPR, Friedrich W. H. Myers, actually was the one who coined our modern word for thought transference, telepathy, while inside the SPR. The ties of mesmerism with the paranormal and spirituality go even deeper. French educator and author Hippolyte Léon Denisard-Rival, who was also interested in both mesmerism and seances, originally proposed that animal magnetism could explain the supposed communication with spirits of the dead that took place in them. However, after seeing a demonstration, he comes to believe that animal magnetism alone was insufficient to explain what he had witnessed. He develops his own studies on paranormal and psychic activity, coming to believe on a spiritual reality parallel to material reality, on which souls and personalities could survive after death, communicate with the living, and reincarnate. And so, under the pen name of Allan Kardec, starting in 1857, he writes a series of books that become the doctrine of Spiritism. The influence of mesmerism on the foundations of Spiritism is still clearly discernible, with practices involving passings of the hand and fluidized water. And so we can see here the inspiration not only for the connection between hypnotism and telepathy that we see with emotion haki, but with another prominent theme in it that I have been glossing over so far: ghosts. From one of our first instances of the power being used by Mary's Klabautermann, that is firstly shown and portrayed as a ghostly apparition, to the similar hypnotic powers of our undead and ghostly Soul King Brook, to so many characters that hint at this stuff, like Bobbing and Pudding being connected to Big Mom, user of the Soul Fruit. So now that I talked about the inspirations of this power coming from the history of hypnosis as a medical practice, I can also share what I think is very likely to also turn out to be one of its abilities, one of its more advanced abilities. The use of hypnosis in psychology and psychiatry was at one point associated with the now discredited practice of recovered memory therapy. Patients were put into hypnosis in order to recall previously forgotten memories, usually with the intent of recovering traumatic memories that supposedly were buried deep into the patient's subconscious as a defense mechanism. The practice has been discredited because patients would actually develop false memories under hypnosis. These false memories were largely responsible for the Satanic Panic, a moral panic originating in the United States in the 1980s with the publication of the book Michelle Remembers, co-written by a Canadian psychiatrist, Lawrence Pasder, and his patient and future wife, Michelle Smith. In it are described Michelle's supposedly recovered memories under hypnosis by Lawrence. In these recovered memories, Michelle sees herself during her childhood subject to torture and other forms of child abuse for days as part of elaborate satanic rituals, culminating in a portal to hell opening and Satan himself pulling up. So remember how Brook was called Satan after appearing in the middle of a satanic ritual due to being sent there by Kuma as if he had been summoned by the ritual? So combined with the ability that I had mentioned in the past, but also in the Conqueror's Haki video specifically, of using Conqueror's Haki to erase memories, I think it should be possible, similar to real-life hypnosis, to use these hypnotic powers of emotion Haki to even implant false memories into people's heads. Of course, as the power to erase memories with Conqueror's Haki was one that I attributed to Imu, it is Imu who probably will turn out to have this ability to give people false memories, which would also fit well with the whole satanic summoning rituals we have seen accompanied with the Gorosei. So, a bit of a summary of the powers of emotion Haki we've seen so far. And of course, I haven't gone through the whole manga again to count all the cases, so this list can probably be expanded, but sharing thoughts like inner monologue. We've seen this used so far by the Going Merry, the Sea Kings of Poseidon, Zunisha, and Luffy. Also probably is the voice in the Poneglyphs that can be heard by ones who can hear the voice of all things. And maybe it's also what the Gorosei were using to speak telepathically. Actually, there were some moments where I think even Imu might have been speaking with them telepathically. Sharing sensory experience. We've seen this used by Zunisha to share his vision with Momo. Sharing emotions, specifically imagine emotions to hypnotize people. We've seen this used by Miss Goldenweek and Brook. Kinda, his situation is a bit weird as explained before. Suspected users are also Jango, Bobbin, and I also heavily suspect Laffitte from the Blackbeard Pirates, who's also a hypnotist, sharing imagined sensory experience to create illusions. Users are again Brook, kinda, and probably Miss Goldenweek when she makes others see their dreams. And I heavily suspect some of Wano's ninja are also users. As we know, Wano has knowledge of Haki, known there as Ryo, that the outside world does not have. Namely, they know about nature Haki, and it is used by their samurai. So likewise, it makes sense that emotion Haki is also known in Wano. And one of the Oniwa Banshu was said to be a specialist in genjutsu, or illusions. So maybe nature Haki is traditionally more the domain of the samurai, while emotion Haki tends to be the domain of ninja. Just speculating. Hearing the voice of all things itself is not a form of emotion Haki. Rather, it is a characteristic of some characters that makes them able to hear voices to be affected by emotion Haki strongly, even when the Haki was not meant for them, not tuned for them. If it is Haki at all, and it's not clear that it is because the unnatural telepathy is already explainable via the usage of emotion Haki, it would be some form of observation. If the use of emotion Haki is like a Den Den Muhsi sending a signal to another, be it sound, vision, emotion, or whatever else, a hearer of the voice of all things is like a black wiretapping Den Den Mushi that can overhear all these messages that were not being sent to them. That said, hearers of the voice of all things also tend to be talented in using emotion Haki, especially for hypnosis and illusions, because these powers largely stem from the same mental qualities. So why is it that this color of Haki, unlike the colors of Armament, Observation, and Supreme King, was not rediscovered since being erased from history at the end of the Void Century? Well, for one, it shares a fundamental problem with the color of nature that similarly remained undiscovered. That is, how unconnected its different abilities can seem. At face value, you wouldn't make the connection between illusions, hypnotism, and telepathy, especially because the telepathy aspect gets confused with the rare ability to hear the voice of all things, making the whole thing more difficult to understand, and hypnotism is something that can exist even without Haki, making users of the ability more questionable if they even are Haki in the first place. The ones that can be safely determined to be Haki being very particular cases like Miss Goldenweek's collar trap. But most important of all, I think, is that the One Piece world, as I had described previously, is one of fighters, explorers, adventurers, and that's a great fit for powers like armament, conquerors, and even observation, but not so much for a power like emotion Haki, a power and ambition of conveying thoughts, experiences, feelings to others. That is more along the realm of artists, those who have strong ambitions to literally convey certain feelings with their art to others, and so who could end up developing this ability to literally imbue their art with their feelings. Artists like the painter Marianne or the musician Brook. Yet in our very Straw Hat crew, there is yet another artist for whom this ability would be very fitting. Cooking, especially at the high level of a gourmet chef, it is absolutely an art form, right? Sanji, like any great cook, seeks to cause certain sensations, certain feelings with his cooking. Just like I explained how the talent for this power is in imagination and empathy, well, we know Sanji is pretty high on empathy, and he needs to have a strong imagination for his cooking. Just like Sanji's usage of flames for fighting heavily relate to his use of flames in his cooking, this power too is likely to stem from his cooking. In fact, it's likely that Sanji has already been using it unconsciously, literally pouring his feelings and imagination into his cooking. And all that he needs to do is realize this and apply this power to fighting. When Sanji is finalizing the wedding cake in Whole Cake Island arc, we see him getting happy just imagining how Big Mom would feel tasting the cake. He's empathizing with her, an enemy, and actively imagining the feelings he seeks to cause on her with the cake. The ingredients for emotion Haki are all already here. And given Sanji's backstory with his abusive father seeing his emotions as a weakness, his mother sacrificing her life to protect his emotions, his biggest fear being to lose his emotions to the German transformation, what could be more fitting than for his emotions to end up being his biggest strength? So what is the foreshadowing, if any, of Sanji's ties to this power? Well, let's see. Who was it on the cover of that chapter on Miss Goldenweek's collar trap? Who was it that impersonated Miss Goldenweek's partner, Mr. 3, during Little Garden? By the way, remember how Sanji's name comes from the number 3, son in Japanese, because he's the third son? Remember the ties to this power, to the Den Den Muhsi? Well, who is it that comes from a nation literally built on top of huge Den Den Muhsi like snails? Who was it that was engaged to a three-eyed woman? So, I'm gonna tell you a little secret. I think it's pretty obvious that I chose the colors for the symbols I have been using for the colors of Haki based on the 5 colors of traditional Chinese culture, the 5 colors associated with whooshing. But why did I choose these specific colors for each color of Haki? Well, in a previous video in this channel, I spoke about Luffy and his 4 commanders, the ones who I believe will be the distinct 4 strongest under Emperor Luffy, and how this is mirrored in Kaido's, in his commanders, etc. And so I thought, what if each of them are supposed to specialize in one of these shades of Haki, only to notice their colors match pretty much exactly the ones from whooshing. But why did I go for this dark blue instead of just black for the color of emotion? Well, for the water phase, traditionally the color is black. But in modern times, in which East Asian cultures do tend to differentiate between green and blue, it's very common to have the wood phase specifically associated with green, and to associate the water phase with blue, which is a far more common association in the rest of the world. And if you notice, Sanji is curiously associated with both blue and black. His official color, according to Oda, is blue. His dream is the all blue, and now he has blue flames. But also he is the black flag. He's most often in a black suit. He would be stealth black in Germa, and in fact, if the Germa transformation continues, as I think it will, he should have a transformation with black hair, matching the theme of his siblings. By the way, this would be yet another parallel he has with Carrot. It's essentially his Sulum. His personality gets a bit darker and his hair changes from blonde to a color associated with the night, in this case black instead of moon white. But what's more, remember Jango? Well, look at how many hymns we can see in him alone. His color scheme is dark blue, he's full of circular shapes in his design, which I guess has something to do with the circular form Enso and Buddha nature, given the connections of this power with some of the themes we also see in Observation Haki. His heart glasses and disturbing heart eyes underneath, I would guess, are a reference to Sanji's recurrent heart eyes. By the way, Brook also has heart sunglasses. He literally is introduced by moonwalking into panel. You know how the one power in Rokushiki that Sanji learns is Moonstep? Every time Jango hypnotized someone, he would say his line 1, 2, Jango, for which he has the epithet Ichi ni no Jango, kinda like Ichiji, Niji, Sanji. Jango later has his own cover story, in which he has a dance duo and becomes best friends with Lieutenant Commander Full Body, eventually becoming his partner in the Marines. You know, the guy Sanji was introduced by beating the shit out of. There's also the fact that Jango was part of the Black Cat Pirates, and his captain was Kuro, literally meaning black, which might have something to do with the Kuro Den Den Mushi used for wiretapping that shares these hints to hearing the voice of all things. Anyways, going into those 4 perceived theories, you also notice that this would make the 2 main users of this power, the 2 hypnotists in the crew, the last ones to join each sea. Actually, as per my theory of the final Straw Hats, Sunny 13, the last one here should be Vivi. Well, other than Brook, there's only one Straw Hat to have canonically used a power of hypnotism. And guess what? It's Vivi. She used hypnotism when she was acting as Miss Wednesday in Baroque Works. Also, it was Vivi who gave us the closest thing to a canon name to this scholar of Haki. Vivi is an interesting case, though, where it's possible she would share the themes of emotion Haki without necessarily using it, because my theory is that she will eventually get Kuma's Nikyu Nikyu no Mi, which should allow her to take conscious experience out of her head, like Kuma took out his memories, well, really copied them, into Paul bubbles that she could then chuck at people to hypnotize them. So she wouldn't even need to use Haki to achieve a similar effect. So I guess the pattern here is royalty, you know, Prince of Germa, Soul King, Princess of Alabasta, and hypnotism. And you know the ties of emotion Haki to mesmerism and hypnotism? Well, Brook's real-world nationality, according to Oda, is Austrian, and Sanji's is French. While Mesmer began his animal magnetism practice in Vienna, Austria, and then it took gigantic proportions in Paris, France. But what about Vivi? Does her real-world nationality have some connection with hypnotism? Well, not with mesmerism, but perhaps to something much earlier than it. Oda has not assigned Vivi a real-world nationality, but given she's the Princess of Alabasta, of course we expect something from the Middle East, right? Egypt especially seems like the obvious answer, given Alabasta is confirmed to be based on ancient Egypt, and Nefertari is confirmed to have come from the name of an Egyptian queen. While the earliest documented account of hypnotic states comes from the writings of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, a Persian philosopher and physician from the 10th century and one of the great thinkers of the Islamic Golden Age. But even earlier than this, in fact, over 4,000 years ago, argued by some to be the earliest known practice of hypnotism, are the sleep temples or dream temples in ancient Egypt. And now I'm thinking that the mushroom stalk on Jango's chin really was supposed to look like the false beards of the pharaoh. Anyways, noticing this pattern, I then wondered if similar patterns for the other colors of Haki apply to the other straw hats. And I would say the results are quite interesting. So, for the first to join HC, Zoro is our Nature Haki specialist, so the same should apply to Chopper and Jinbei, right? While Chopper, I theorized in the Nature Haki video, will use Nature Haki to perform something like Seimei Kikan, but instead of his own body, he would control the body of his patients to perform miracles. And Jinbei specializes in Fishman Karate and Fishman Jujutsu, which I claim are using Nature Haki to manipulate the breath of water. So far so good. For the second to join HC, we have Carrot, who should end up being our observation specialist. So both Nami and Robin should have strong ties to observation as well, right? Well, one commenter in the observation hack video sure cooked by pointing out that Nami could be using some form of breath sensing, which I had explained was a form of observation equivalent to sensing the presence of people and animals to sense the weather, sensing the current state of the atmosphere. Given she first shows this ability precisely when she was very close to death, right before Drum Island, just like Zoro was when he first sensed the breath of things. Nami continues after this to sense things about the weather, like the barometric pressure of the air, in ways that sure seem like they should only be possible with observation haki. For Robin, she hasn't shown any as far as I'm aware, but given Robin is always so calm and observation is born out of ambitions of awareness, of knowledge, and Robin is the one with a dream entirely about knowledge, observation does make a lot of sense for her character. She also has a lot of ties to Buddhism, so thematically it makes sense as well. I gotta say though, I do wish she would get armament at some point. Moving on. For the third to join HC, here we have Yamato, meaning this is about armament. Well, armament just superficially seems like it would make a lot of sense for Frankie. It would make sense, for example, for him to use it to further reinforce his creations, like Frankie's Shogun that recently got destroyed in his fight with Sasaki. And he certainly has that will to be strong and that immovable stubbornness about him. We see that very clearly when he tries to stop a train with his bare arms. But then we have Usopp, who so far has used observation and only observation, which makes sense for the sniper in the crew. While I do think there is more to come for Usopp in terms of observation, like he would be my bet for a Straw Hat who eventually gets Future Sight. Maybe Oda has something even bigger in store for him in terms of armament. Given his dreams of being this brave warrior, and he always lying about himself being ridiculously strong, arguably armament makes even more sense than observation for his character. And given his biggest shortcoming in his last big fight in Onigashima was not being able to pierce the opponent's defenses, maybe it is armament that he is truly in dire need of. That leaves us with Luffy as the sole Supreme King Specialist, which, you know, makes sense for the captain and the one always going on about becoming the Pirate King. Well, that is it for this Haki videos, at least the pre-recorded ones. If there's enough interest in it, as I spoke about before, I'll do a live stream to discuss with you guys directly your own takes on Haki, any ideas that this series might have inspired, any questions you might have, etc. If you stuck with me through the whole thing, I appreciate it. G.U.S.T, of course, is not over. I still have to talk about a bunch of other stuff like Lunarian powers or that energy Vegapunk talked about. But of course, the big thing is Devil Fruits. which will be the main topic of part 3 of G.U.S.T. That one will not take a year though, I promise. It's all mostly worked out in my head already. It's mostly a question of me actually making the video. Also, it won't be like 6 hours long. Anyways, I hope you have enjoyed this overtly long theory on Haki. See you in the comments and ciao!